Ghislaine Maxwell. She has been found guilty of helping Jeffrey Epstein sexually abuse young girls. Throughout the trial, jurors heard from 4 women who accused Maxwell of luring them into Epstein's homes in order to have sex with powerful men, including Epstein. 2 were as young as 14 at the time. Now, Ghislaine denied the charges, but did not take the stand in her defense. The 60-year-old now faces up to 65 years behind bars. Her lawyer says they will appeal. So to talk more about this guilty verdict, we are joined by former prosecutor and defense attorney Mari Henderson. Mari, thank you so much for joining us. Now, our viewers are lighting up our chat. They all are so happy to see that she received this guilty verdict. What was your reaction? Did you expect her to be found guilty?
Yes, I expected her to be found guilty after this few-week trial. There was a mountain of evidence against her. It wasn't just the 4 women who took the stand and testified against her. The prosecution presented over 20 different witnesses to help corroborate what she had done in these decades of abuse with Jeffrey Epstein. And what, in your opinion, because when I watched the trial, I thought the prosecution was just on fire. But I'm not an attorney like you are. Was there one smoking gun that you thought, okay, this is exactly what is going to convince the jury? You know, I believe there was more than one smoking gun. One big thing that stood out to me was when they actually brought in the massage table to show the jurors, because props like that can be very powerful evidence because it takes them back in time and really shows them the moment that these women testified about. And not only the massage table is the prop, but also the prosecution did a very good job of showing that these women were credible, because the defense, all they had to say was that these women were liars. And the prosecution, I think, did a very good job of bolstering up their credibility and showing they were telling the truth.
Well, I mean, that's my question about telling the truth, because a couple weeks ago we saw Jussie Smollett take the stand and people said that he hurt his case by taking the stand. But she didn't take the stand. So do you think that she hurt her case by not taking the stand?
No, I think had she taken the stand, she would have been absolutely crucified on cross-examination. Sometimes it makes sense for a defendant to take the stand, especially if they're arguing self-defense. But here, there was absolutely nothing to be gained by her taking the stand.
And just really quickly, I have a question. I've always wanted to ask a lawyer. So what other circumstances would you ever suggest to your client that they take the stand? You said self-defense. What other circumstances?
I mean, sometimes the client, it's ultimately their decision. It's their decision alone. So even if you advise them not to take the stand, they want to tell their story. And there's certain situations where that makes sense. I mean, Kim Potter took the stand in her own defense, and she showed remorse in that. Ultimately, she was still convicted, but I think that will help with her sentence. But Ghislaine Maxwell taking the stand was not going to do anything to help her.
All right. I think the question everybody has, Mari, and including me, do you think naming names would help her sentence in any way? Maybe shorten it or even get it wiped off? Could she get a retrial if she decides to come forward with people's names and proof?
I hope she names names.
I think that's what everybody wants.
She's not going to get a retrial because of that. The only time she'd get a retrial is if, as her family already indicated, they're going to appeal the decision, and if for some reason the conviction were reversed. The time for which she should have or would have named names would have been before she went to trial. The prosecution could have entered into a plea agreement with her wherein she named names against, you know, the powerful people who are involved, Prince Andrew, former presidents, and then she got a lesser sentence because of that. But now that she's already gone to trial and she's lost, that any sort of plea deal by the prosecution is off the table. So what the judge is going to be considering now is her lack of criminal history and if she ultimately shows any signs of remorse.
Wait, really quickly, Ghislaine, because I know that everybody wants. I'm sorry. I was going to refer to Ghislaine. Mari, that's a huge insult. I apologize. Mari, in regard to Ghislaine, everybody hopes that she names names. So you're telling me if for whatever reason she says to the prosecution behind closed doors, I'm ready to name names, there's no way that they can somehow lessen her sentence?
I mean, they can the sentence is ultimately up to the judge. She is the one who will determine the sentence. The prosecution can put together their recommendation, but the time to have named names would have been before she went to trial. Yikes. But she took a gamble, she took a risk, and she decided to take this thing all the way to trial without naming names. So it's a little too late it's a little too late for her. Too little, too late.
How much jail time, Mari, quickly, do you think she'll end up getting?
I think that she's going to die behind bars because she's 60 years old. She's facing a maximum of 65 years in prison. The sex trafficking count alone carries a maximum of 40 years. So even if the judge were to take into account, the fact that she has no criminal history, if she does decide to name names and talk about Prince Andrew, former Presidents Clinton and Trump and other people, still she's going to be facing more than a decade behind bars. So I do think that she will live out the rest of her years in prison.
And a lot of the victims were devastated when Jeffrey Epstein died. And so now this is some sign of justice for them. So what does this verdict say to other victims of abuse, in your opinion?
I think this verdict, just like the Harvey Weinstein verdict that came before him and the Bill Cosby verdict before it was overturned that came before him, shows that women should be believed even if it's been decades since it's happened. I think jurors are starting to understand the trauma that comes along with sexual assault and sexual abuse, and that it doesn't mean you're lying if you don't report it to police the next day or that night. It can take time for a victim to process what's happened to them and to equate that with abuse or assault.
That's a really important precedent. Thank you so much, Mari Henderson. We really appreciate all your insight on this case.